There are stories in Scripture so dark, so haunting that we whisper them, if we speak them at all. This is one such story. It is the story of a city brought to its knees not by sword or plague, but by silence from heaven and starvation that made monsters out of mothers. A story not just of war but of the war within, between faith and fear, mercy and madness. This is the tale of Samaria under siege, of a broken king, of 2 desperate women, and of a God whose voice seemed lost in the hunger, until the moment he broke through with a whisper that shattered despair. This is the story of the Cannibal Mothers, and though you may flinch, though you may want to turn away, stay. Because hidden in the ashes is a truth that still echoes for us all. The sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows over the ancient city of Samaria. Its golden gates, once gleaming in splendor, now creaked with neglect. Cracks had begun to show in the once proud walls, silent testimony to months of fear and starvation. Outside, the enemy lay in wait. The air was heavy with smoke and silence. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, had come with wrath in his eyes and an army at his back. Thousands of tents stretched across the plains, a sea of iron and fire. Aramean warriors stood like statues, patient, merciless. They had surrounded Samaria like a noose around a dying man's throat, cutting off trade, water, and any hope of escape. Inside the city, time no longer moved in hours or days. It dragged on in heartbeats, in the sound of crying children, in the whispers of the old, and the quiet desperation of the young. Food had become legend. Wheat was a dream. The market stalls, once filled with fresh fruit and bread, now offered nothing but the echo of better days. In the poorest corners of the city, women scraped dust from the stones, boiling it with bitter herbs in broken pots. Anything to quiet the growling in their stomachs. Men, once strong and proud, staggered through the streets like shadows, bones jutting beneath their skin, eyes glazed with hunger. Dogs had vanished from the alleys, eaten weeks ago. One man, Uriel, a father of 3, sat with his back against a crumbling wall, cradling a leather pouch that once held dates. He opened it and stared at the emptiness inside, his cracked lips trembling with prayer. His wife, Tamar, held their youngest against her chest. The child no longer cried, he only whimpered. They named him Eliakim, God will raise, though now Tamar feared God had forgotten them all. Did you hear? A whisper passed from mouth to ear in the narrow passageways. A donkey's head sold for 80 silver pieces. A donkey's head? Someone replied. 80% silver? Who has that kind of money left? And a measure of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver, added another voice, bitter with disbelief. We're paying for filth like it's gold. A bitter laugh broke out among a group of beggars. Soon we'll be boiling our sandals and calling it stew. But no one laughed for long. Hunger had stripped away humor, decency, even hope. The elders gathered in silence near the city gate. Their robes were faded, their eyes hollow. They spoke little. What could be said? Every day they watched the horizon, praying for a miracle, dreading the moment the enemy would break through. But Ben-Hadad did not rush. He didn't need to. He had time, and hunger was his sword. King Jehoram, son of Ahab, stood in his palace, staring out through the high windows at the dying city. His fingers twitched on the stone ledge. He had tried to hold Samaria together with decrees, with rationing, with military counsel. But nothing he did could break the siege, and worse, he heard the murmurs from the people. Accusations, whispers of rebellion. Where is the Lord now? Some asked. Why does the God of Israel not defend his people? The king turned from the window, pacing the room, his mind darkened with doubt. His father Ahab had been wicked but strong, his mother Jezebel cruel but cunning. And him, He had tried to honor the Lord, tried to listen to the prophet Elisha, but this siege was a curse he could not understand. Behind him his steward bowed low. "My lord, shall we distribute what little grain remains from the royal storehouses?" Jehoram's jaw clenched. "Distribute it to whom? We have no bread left, no barley, no oil. All we have are prayers and bones." The steward remained silent. Outside the wind picked up, and with it came the faint sound of weeping from the lower city. Night fell slowly over Samaria, but it brought no rest. Fires flickered behind closed doors. Families huddled together for warmth more than comfort. Mothers whispered lullabies to starving children, weaving tales of the past, of manna in the wilderness, of Elijah's miracles, of the God who once fed a widow and her son with flour that never ran dry. But in the silence, a darker song was rising, one of despair, one of madness. Hunger was not just a thief, it was a whispering demon, planting dangerous ideas in the minds of the desperate. And outside the city, in the quiet calm of his tent, Ben-Hadad smiled. The siege had only just begun. The dawn came gray and joyless, bleeding slowly into a city that had forgotten the meaning of light. Samaria stirred, not in hope, but in habit. People moved through the streets like ghosts with empty bellies, eyes scanning for anything that could be chewed, swallowed, traded. Hunger had a voice now. It moaned in the wind, echoed in the silence, and hissed in every corner. No one trusted anyone anymore. At the city's edge, an old woman named Hadassah sat near the broken stones of a collapsed stall. Her fingers clutched a dried root. She gnawed at it slowly, as if savoring every trace of memory it held. A child approached her, barefoot and trembling. "Grandmother," the girl whispered, "do you have food?" Hadassah looked at the girl, no older than 5, with sunken cheeks and lips cracked from thirst. She said nothing, just handed the girl the rest of the root, watching her devour it with the desperation of a wild thing. Then the old woman leaned against the wall and wept, not from pity but from guilt. That was the last root she had. In the richer quarter, the homes of nobles were no safer. Silver platters held nothing but dust. Rich men sold family heirlooms for moldy crumbs. One merchant, once a man of power, now traded pearls for a piece of dried leather, anything that could be boiled. And the whispers continued. "They say people are eating rats," a young boy murmured to his older sister, as they picked through the refuse near the wall. "Rats are gone," she replied flatly. "Someone paid 2 silver pieces for one last week. They also say—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "They say someone ate their own child." His sister turned and slapped him. "Don't speak that," she hissed. "Don't even let that thought live in your mouth." But even she knew. The rumors were spreading like fire through straw. On the palace steps, soldiers stood guard with dull eyes and drooping shoulders. Their armor no longer gleamed. Many had sold their swords or melted down pieces of their gear to barter for food. Discipline was breaking down. A captain barked orders, but his voice cracked with weakness. Even warriors could not fight on empty stomachs. In one of the narrow alleyways, 2 women sat close together beneath a torn shawl. Their names were Zimra and Tirzah, neighbors, once friends, now bound together by something darker, an agreement they had not yet spoken aloud, but had begun to consider in silence. Tirzah rocked her child in her lap, her eyes sunken but still fierce. "I can't watch her die," she murmured. "Not like this. I'd rather it be quick." Zimra didn't respond at first. Her own son lay curled beside her, barely breathing. "We have no flour, no water, no oil, nothing left to boil." Zimra's voice was hollow. "We could." Tirzah hesitated. "There's another way." Their eyes met, and in that long moment, Something ancient and sacred cracked. No one had spoken it before, but now the idea had been born, and it would not die. Above them, in the palace, King Jehoram wandered the halls alone. The throne room was silent. His counselors had no more plans. His priests had no more prayers. All eyes were turning to Elisha the prophet, but the king no longer knew whether to trust the man of God or curse him. "It's because of him," Jehoram whispered bitterly. "He told us to trust in the Lord. He said there would be deliverance. Where is it now?" He strode to a window, looking out over the city. He saw beggars fighting over rotting cabbage leaves. He saw women collapsing in the streets. He saw children too tired to cry. A voice behind him broke the silence. "My king," said the steward, "a woman waits at the gate. She says it's urgent." Jehoram turned, his eyes blazing. What could be more urgent than the death of a nation? "She's weeping, my lord. She says it's about justice. Justice." The word felt like mockery now. Still, the king nodded. "Bring her to me." And below in the shadow, Zimra whispered to Tirzah, "Tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow." Night fell like a shroud over Samaria. The once vibrant city now lay still beneath a veil of despair. Fires flickered in only a few homes. Wood was too precious to burn. Most huddled in corners with their children, using their bodies to share warmth they barely had. The city was quiet, but it was not peace. It was surrender. In a small, crumbling dwelling near the southern wall, Zimra sat beside her son, Eitan. He was 6 years old, once full of laughter and stories. Now, his ribs rose sharply under thin skin, his breath shallow, eyes closed but not quite asleep. She had no song left in her, no food, no hope. And yet, she rocked him gently, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing during storms. Her voice cracked as the words rose from her dry throat. "Sleep, my child, though thunder rolls. Mama guards your weary soul. Stars above may hide their light, but I'll hold you through the night." Zimra's voice broke, and she covered her mouth to muffle the sob. She bent forward, pressing her lips to Eitan's forehead. It burned with fever. He opened his eyes slowly. "Mama, do you think there's food in heaven?" Her heart cracked, but she smiled. "Yes, baby, the best food. Honey and sweet bread. Milk that never runs out." "Will God give me some?" he asked, eyes wide as if he could already smell it. "He will," she whispered. "He sees you. He knows you're hungry." Eitan nodded slowly. "Okay, I want to go there." Zimra looked away, blinking back tears. "Not yet. Just sleep for now. We'll eat again soon. I promise." But her promise was hollow. She had nothing, and tomorrow would be the hardest day of her life. Across the alley, Tirzah rocked her daughter, Yael, in much the same way. But there was a wildness in her eyes, less grief, more fury. She didn't sing, she whispered, murmured things under her breath, as if cursing the gods, the king, and even the child in her arms. "I begged the Lord. I pleaded. I sacrificed. I prayed," she hissed. "What has he given me?" "Dust. Silence," Yael whimpered, too weak to speak. "Tomorrow," Tirzah said, stroking the child's hair. "Tomorrow we will eat. I will live. You will save me." She looked across the alley at Zimra's home. The deal was made. One child today, one tomorrow. They would boil the flesh, divide the meat, and survive another week. It was unthinkable, but in Samaria now, the unthinkable was survival. Tirzah had already prepared a pot. She had gathered bits of salt from the floor of a collapsed bakery. She had found a single bay leaf clinging to a dying plant. She was ready. But that night, as Yael shivered in her arms, Tirzah hesitated. She had birthed this child, nursed her, watched her take her first steps, watched her laugh in the summer sun, and now… Tirzah clenched her jaw. This is not murder, she told herself. This is mercy. This is war. In the morning, the sun rose on a city in ruins. The cries of a mother echoed faintly through the alleyways. Zimra stood outside her door, holding her son's limp body in her arms. Tirzah approached slowly, her eyes locked on the child. "Are we doing this?" Zimra whispered. Tirzah looked at her daughter, still asleep. "Yes," she said, though her voice trembled. "Today, your son. Tomorrow, mine." Zimra closed her eyes and nodded. She did not speak again. She handed Eitan over, and somewhere beyond the city walls, the Aramean camp laughed and drank around their fires, unaware of the horror they had seeded. The siege had not just crushed a city, it had broken mothers. The sun was high, but its warmth brought no comfort. King Jehoram stood atop the wall of Samaria, his royal robes dusty and torn at the edges. The wind carried with it the scent of rot, of sweat, and of hopelessness. Below him the city sprawled like a dying beast, homes quiet, streets empty, spirits broken. He looked down at his people. A woman collapsed beside a cistern, too weak to stand. A man dragged himself through the dirt, sucking at the cracks in the stone for any sign of moisture. Jehoram's fingers gripped the stone battlement until his knuckles turned white. "What kind of king am I?" he thought. "What kind of God allows this?" His heart thundered beneath his chest. Anger and sorrow warred within him. He had inherited this throne from a father whose name was a stain upon Israel. Ahab had built temples to Baal, spilled innocent blood, and married Jezebel, a woman whose cruelty had scorched the land like fire. Jehoram had tried to turn back, tried to heed the word of Elisha, tried to destroy the idols, but the sins of a nation were not so easily undone. Now the city starved, and the Lord was silent. "My king," a voice called. He turned. It was the palace steward again, his face pale, eyes wide. "There's a woman below the wall," the steward said. "She demands an audience with you." Jehoram's brow furrowed. Who dares make demands in a city of death? She says it's about justice. Justice. That cursed word again. Jehoram descended the stone steps and stepped through the narrow streets to meet her. The crowd parted slowly, not out of reverence, but out of weariness. They had no strength left for kings, no hope left in crowns. The woman stood with her garments torn. Dust covered her head, her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands, her trembling hands, were red with something darker. She fell at the king's feet. "My lord," she cried, "help me." Jehoram's voice was hollow. "If the Lord does not help you, how can I? Shall I bring food from the threshing floor, wine from the winepress? We have nothing left." But the woman grabbed the hem of his robe, weeping. "This woman and I, we made a pact," she sobbed. "We agreed that today we would eat my son and tomorrow we would eat hers." Gasps rippled through the small gathering. Eyes widened, mouths fell open in horror. But the woman went on, her voice rising in fury. "So we boiled my son. We ate him. But when I came to her the next day, she had hidden her child." Jehoram's heart stopped. Silence hung in the air like a blade. He looked down at the woman, her face twisted in pain, not just grief but betrayal, madness, desperation. His knees weakened. The weight of her words crushed him. He took 2 steps back, eyes wide as if trying to flee the truth. And then, slowly, he reached up and tore his royal robes down the middle. The crowd gasped again, not at the gesture, but at what lay beneath. Sackcloth, rough, black, and worn. The garment of mourning and repentance. The king of Israel had been fasting, mourning, suffering in silence beneath the trappings of power. Tears filled Jehoram's eyes. His lips trembled. "O Lord," he whispered, "what has become of us?" But then his sorrow twisted into rage. "Elisha," he muttered, venom now in his voice. "The man of God said there would be deliverance. He said the Lord would protect us. Where is he now? Where is his mercy?" The crowd watched as the king turned away, fury rising with every step. "I swear before the Lord," Jehoram growled, "this day I will take the head of Elisha from his shoulders." And just like that, grief turned to wrath. The king's heart had snapped, not just from the cries of the people, but from the weight of the prophecy that had not come to pass. As the sun began its slow descent, Samaria held its breath. A city grieving, a mother broken, a king unraveling. And the prophet of God, somewhere in the city, waiting for what came next. The shadows lengthened as the sun dipped behind the hills surrounding Samaria. Inside the broken city, darkness was no longer the absence of light, it was a presence. It moved through the alleys and over rooftops, whispering into the ears of the desperate. Fear had long since given way to madness. Behind a collapsed granary, where the stone walls still offered a sliver of privacy, two women met beneath the cover of dusk. Their faces were drawn, hollow with hunger, yet lit with a fevered glint, an unspoken understanding pulsing between them. Zimra's hands trembled as she wiped sweat from her brow. Her stomach was empty, but it twisted with sickness. The boy, her boy, was gone, Eitan. His name echoed in her head with every heartbeat. The taste still lingered on her tongue, and it made her want to scream. Across from her, Tirzah stood still, her arms crossed, her face stony. "It's your turn," Zimra said, voice barely a whisper. "That was the agreement." Tirzah looked away. "My daughter is weak, sick. If I give her up now, the meat will be spoiled by morning." Zimra's eyes flared. "Spoiled? Did I wait when it was my son? Did I make excuses?" Silence. "She trusted you," Zimra said, her voice hardening. "I trusted you. We made a covenant in suffering. Now you break it?" Tirzah's lips curled. "I'm a mother. I did what I had to do, and I won't let her go. Not yet." Zimra stepped forward, fury now burning beneath her skin. "You took my son. You boiled him like an animal, and now you dare." A sudden cry broke the air. It was Yael, Tirzah's daughter, crying weakly from the corner of the alley where she lay wrapped in an old cloth. The sound was fragile, pitiful. Zimra's voice cracked. I hear him in her voice. "My Eitan. He cried like that the night before. He begged me not to let go." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "You said we'd survive. You said this was how we would live." Tirzah turned slowly. "I lied." Zimra lunged at her. The two women fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs and dust. They clawed and screamed. Two starving mothers turned beasts. Hair was torn, skin scratched. Tirzah bit down on Zimra's shoulder, drawing blood. Zimra screamed and struck her across the face. Then silence. They lay panting, bruised and broken, staring up at the dimming sky. "This siege has taken everything," Tirzah said bitterly. "Even our souls." Zimra pulled away, shivering. "You owe me. You owe him." Tirzah closed her eyes. "Go to the king then. Tell him. What will he do? Feed you? Kill me?" Zimra said nothing. She stood, wrapped her torn robe around her body, and turned away. Her steps were slow, unsteady. Tirzah sat beside her child, stroking Yael's head as the girl coughed softly. In the stillness, two broken mothers sat in a city that had forgotten mercy, and in the palace a blade was being sharpened. The king had sent a messenger to Elisha, and death was coming. The night was thick with silence, but it was not peace, it was dread, hovering like smoke in every corner of Samaria. No dogs barked. No laughter echoed. Only the wind whispered through empty streets, and somewhere deep in the heart of the city the sound of water boiling rose like a demon's hymn. The fire was weak, fed by bits of splintered wood and torn fabric, but it was enough. The pot, a dented copper relic once used for lentils and lamb, now held something else. Something sacred, something unspeakable. Zimra sat beside it, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. Her eyes were swollen, not just from crying but from the weight of it all. The child she had once carried within her had been taken, and now boiled for survival. She stared into the steam, watching it twist into strange shapes. For a moment it looked like Eitan's face, smiling at her, then vanishing. Tirza moved mechanically. Her face was blank, as though her soul had gone somewhere far away. She stirred the pot with a broken spoon, not looking at its contents. Her daughter, Yael, lay asleep. No, not asleep, drugged. A piece of opium root had been crushed and slipped into her lips, just enough to dull her senses. She won't feel it, Tirza had said. It will be quick. She won't suffer. Zimra hadn't answered. She hadn't spoken since dusk. The fire crackled, the pot hissed. Tirza's hands trembled as she added a pinch of salt, collected over weeks from her own tears, from the edges of pots licked clean 100 times. "You don't have to watch," Tirza whispered. Still, Zimra said nothing. "I'll make it clean, merciful, then we," Zimra interrupted, her voice hoarse. "We don't exist anymore." Tirza froze. Her eyes flickered to the knife lying beside the pot. She reached for it with numb fingers. Then the girl stirred. Yael's eyes opened. Her mouth moved silently, then managed a whisper. "Mama?" Tirza froze. The knife slipped from her hand. Zimra turned her face away. The child's voice cut through her like a blade. It wasn't just guilt, it was grief wearing the skin of hatred. She stood suddenly, knocking over the pot. Scalding liquid splashed onto her legs, but she didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. "You can't do it," she said. Tirza sat frozen, wide-eyed. "You lied to me. You made me do it. You let me kill my child while you planned to keep yours." Tirza's lip trembled. "I couldn't. I thought I could, but I—" Zimra slapped her, hard. Then again. The sound echoed through the alley. "You betrayed a mother's heart," Zimra growled. "You took my son. You took my soul." Tirza wept. But Zimra didn't stay to see it. She turned, and with blood still on her robe and steam rising from her burned legs, she limped away into the night. Toward the king, toward justice. Tirza collapsed beside her daughter, holding her tightly, sobbing into her small chest. But the scent of boiled flesh still lingered in the air. It clung to their skin, to their mouths, to the soul of the city itself. Outside, a jackal howled in the distance, and from the palace tower a cry went up. "The king has torn his robe. He walks in sackcloth." The city stirred. Something was changing. But for Zimra, it was already too late. Zimra stood before the palace gate, her robe soaked with blood and boiling water, her feet raw and cracked. The guards hesitated to stop her. Something in her eyes warned them not to touch her. She was not a woman anymore. She was the embodiment of agony, of vengeance. "I want to see the king," she rasped. "You can't—" one guard began. But then he saw her hands, her face, her broken body trembling not from weakness but fury. Word traveled fast. The king had just descended from the wall. He was pacing the inner court, wild-eyed, muttering to himself, the hem of his robe still torn, the sackcloth underneath exposed to all. He was a king unraveling, held together by rage alone. The chamber doors swung open. Zimra stepped into the throne hall, her face streaked with ash and tears. Jehoram looked up. At first he said nothing, he simply stared. Then slowly he descended from his throne, each step deliberate, his sandals scraping the cold stone floor. He recognized her. "You," he said. Zimra bowed, not in reverence, but in a motion of collapse. "You asked what could be worse than the death of a nation," she whispered. "I'll tell you." The room fell silent. She lifted her face, eyes burning. "I gave up my son to survive. I killed him with my own hands, cooked him, ate his flesh, and when I came for justice, the woman who made the vow with me hid her child." Jehoram staggered back, clutching his chest. "My child was not an animal," she said. He laughed. "He called me Mama. He believed me when I said everything would be okay." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never shook. "I gave him to death so that I might live. And now I want justice." The king collapsed to his knees. His fingers tore deeper into the sackcloth beneath his robe. His face was pale, sickened. "The Lord see me," he whispered. "The Lord judge between us. But if the prophet Elisha lives another day, may God strike me down." Zimra's eyes widened. "Elisha?" Jehoram rose, trembling with fury. "He said the Lord would deliver us. He said famine would not destroy this city. He promised hope, and instead, we eat our children in silence." He turned to his captain. "Go, take men, find the prophet. This ends today." Zimra watched him, stunned. "He's not your enemy," she whispered. "We are—" The king didn't hear her, or maybe he didn't care. As the guards rushed from the room, Zimra sank to her knees again. The pain had turned into something else, an empty, endless echo. She had come seeking justice, but justice, like food, was gone from the land. The halls of the palace echoed with hurried footsteps. Steel clinked against stone as the king's men gathered their weapons, not in defense of the city, but in pursuit of a prophet. The order was clear: find Elisha, kill him, end the silence from heaven. But even as soldiers moved through the city with purpose, the air was thick with something darker than war: regret. King Jehoram stood alone in the inner court. His royal robe lay crumpled beside him. The sackcloth underneath was stained with sweat, ash, and dried blood. His crown sat crooked on his head, forgotten in his grief. His ears still rang with Zimra's words. "We are the enemy." He hated her for saying it, because it was true. When he looked out over Samaria now, he no longer saw his people. He saw walking graves. The city wasn't just starving, it had surrendered its soul. There were no more laws, no more faith, only survival, only madness. He staggered toward the palace gate and stepped into the street, wanting to hear the cries of his people with his own ears. They were no longer begging, they had passed that stage. Now they murmured, eyes sunken, voices hollow. They didn't see him, or if they did, they didn't care. And then a sound pierced the air, a voice, shrill and broken. "Justice! Justice, my king!" It was Zimra again. She stood barefoot in the courtyard, her arms raised to the heavens. "You walk in sackcloth, but where was your sorrow when the markets emptied? Where was your sackcloth when the children began dying in their mother's arms?" The crowd turned. Zimra's voice climbed like thunder. "You wear the robe of mourning now, but we, mothers, fathers, children, we've worn it in silence for weeks. We've buried our dead in secret. We've dug graves with our bare hands while your palace stood tall." Jehoram didn't move. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them. Her grief was no longer private. It belonged to the city now. "I gave up my child to live. But life is no reward when it costs you everything." The crowd was still, silent. A child reached up and clutched Zimra's robe. She looked down, and for a second, her eyes filled with something soft, then hardened again. "This siege is not just Ben-Hadad's doing," she shouted. "This is judgment. We defied the God of Israel, and now our sons are cooked in pots." The king fell to his knees. He covered his face with both hands. She stepped toward him, voice softer now. "You want to kill Elisha? Kill me instead. At least then, one innocent soul may be spared from our madness." Jehoram looked up. His face was broken, not just with sorrow but shame. "I was not strong enough," he whispered. "Not like David, not like Moses. I tried to lead." Zimra knelt beside him. "We don't need strength, my king," she said gently. "We need God." The wind stirred. A strange hush settled over the courtyard. Then, from the temple steps, a voice rang out. "Is this how far we've fallen?" Everyone turned. Elisha. The prophet stood tall, robes fluttering in the wind. His eyes were fire, his face carved in grief. "You cried out to heaven," he said. "You tore your robe, King of Israel. But what you did not do was listen." Jehoram rose slowly. "Where were you, prophet? While we ate flesh and buried infants, where was your God?" Elisha's gaze burned. He was watching, and mourning, and waiting. "For your heart, not your robe, to tear," the crowd murmured. And Elisha raised a hand. "Hear now the word of the Lord," he said. "By this time tomorrow, flour will be sold at the gate for a silver coin, barley for even less. The siege will end, the famine will lift. But beware, O king, you may see it with your eyes and never taste it with your tongue." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Jehoram stared at him, unsure whether to weep, laugh, or rage. And Zimra? She turned her eyes to heaven, daring to hope once more. The city held its breath. Elisha's words drifted over Samaria like morning mist, soft yet cutting, tender yet filled with the fire of divine judgment. By this time tomorrow, could it be? Could flour and barley once again fill the market stalls? Could bread rise in ovens that had grown cold with dust and despair? For a heartbeat, hope sparked in the hearts of the people, too fragile to hold, too impossible to trust. King Jehoram stared at the prophet as though seeing a man returned from the grave. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He had called for Elisha's head only hours before, vowing to spill the blood of the one he believed had deceived them. Yet now the prophet stood before him, untouched by fear, unmoved by threat, speaking with the voice of heaven itself. From behind the king, one of his officers scoffed, a tall man with a lean face and hollow cheeks. He stepped forward, contempt curdling in his voice. "Even if the Lord were to open the floodgates of heaven," the officer said, "how could such a thing be?" Elisha turned his gaze upon him, and the temperature in the courtyard seemed to shift. "You will see it with your own eyes," the prophet said, "but you shall not eat of it." The officer's mouth tightened, but he said no more. Jehoram staggered back, rubbing his face with both hands. He felt like a man awakening from a nightmare only to realize the horror had not yet ended. He turned to Zimra, whose tear-streaked face remained lifted toward the sky. "I wore sackcloth," the king muttered. "I fasted, I prayed, but none of it was enough." Zimra nodded. "Because sackcloth on the outside means nothing if your heart doesn't break with it." And Jehoram knew. She was right. He stood tall and faced the people. With trembling fingers, he reached for the brooch on his shoulder and unclasped the royal insignia. The cloak of kingship fell from his shoulders and landed on the stone with a muted thud. The crown followed. "I have no right to lead you," he said. Murmurs rose, but Elisha stepped forward. "This is not the end, O king," he said, "but the moment of turning." Jehoram met his eyes. "Then what must I do?" "Let the people see your brokenness," Elisha said. Let them see your mourning, not for power, but for righteousness. Then the Lord will hear." The king knelt in the dust, and behind him others began to kneel. First 1, then 10, then hundreds, mothers and fathers, soldiers and scribes. Even Tirzah, who clutched her daughter to her chest, knelt with trembling lips. In silence they bowed not to the king, not to the prophet, but to the God they had forsaken. And in that courtyard, surrounded by pain and loss and ashes, the city of Samaria began to weep, not from hunger, not from fear, but from repentance. The rending of garments had come and gone. Now it was the hearts that were torn open, and heaven, watching, began to stir. Elisha stood on the steps of the palace courtyard, his eyes sweeping across the broken city. Around him, the people of Samaria knelt in silence, their faces pressed to the dust, their robes tattered, hearts laid bare. The weeping had subsided, replaced now by the sound of quiet prayer, raw and real. It was not a religious performance. It was desperation turned into reverence. Hope had entered the city, not loud and triumphant, but soft, like morning light after a long night of storms. The prophet looked upward. The sky was pale and cloudless, and yet he could feel the rumble of a coming change, not in the heavens, but in the hearts below. He turned to King Jehoram, who remained on his knees, head bowed, his royal mantle lying forgotten on the stones behind him. "Rise," Elisha said gently. Jehoram lifted his face, eyes red with repentance. "There is still a promise," Elisha continued. "Despite the horror, despite the sin, God does not forget his covenant." "But we broke it," Jehoram whispered. "Yes," Elisha agreed, "but he is not like us." The prophet looked out over the city, beyond the gate, toward the hills that hemmed them in, where the Aramean camp still burned with cruel confidence. He closed his eyes. He could feel it now, the stirring of divine reversal. The siege was cracking. Deliverance was moving, like wind beneath the surface of still water. And God was about to prove once again that he could feed a nation with crumbs, or bring armies to their knees with whispers. He turned to one of his servants. "Come with me," he said. "There is a word still to be spoken." The servant followed him through the streets, where people now watched in quiet awe. No one jeered. No one mocked. Some touched the prophet's robe as he passed, whispering prayers through parched lips. Outside the city, beyond the gate, 4 lepers stood at the edge of the wall. They were gaunt and weary, their bodies bearing the scars of exile. For days they had watched the city from a distance, neither welcomed inside nor slain by the enemy. They were the forgotten, the discarded. But on this day, one of them stepped forward. "Why do we sit here until we die?" he said to the others. "There is no food in the city. If we enter, we'll die. And if we stay here, we die as well." A long silence passed between them. "Let us go to the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die." It was madness. But hunger had taught them that madness was often the door to miracles. Elisha watched them from a distance, his eyes glowing. The servant looked confused. "They're lepers. They're nothing?" "No," Elisha said softly. "They are the first ripple of God's mercy." The lepers began to walk toward the enemy camp. 4 men, diseased, shunned, powerless. And yet with every step they took, the earth seemed to tremble. Not visibly, not audibly, but in the unseen realm, something was shifting. Elisha smiled. "By this time tomorrow," he whispered again, "there will be bread in the streets, and no sword will be drawn." His servant stared at him. "But how?" Elisha turned to him with a knowing gaze. "Because our God," he said, "does not need chariots or armies to win battles. Sometimes all he needs is a few broken men and the courage to move forward." And in the distance, As the lepers disappeared into the valley, the wind picked up, the siege was breaking, and hope, God's hope, was on the move. Night had fallen again over the Aramean camp. The siege had worn on for weeks, but inside the tents of the enemy there was no urgency, no fear. Fires crackled, meat sizzled on open spits, and laughter echoed among the soldiers. They drank from goblets of stolen wine, feasted on foreign delicacies, and mocked the starving Israelites beyond the walls. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, reclined beneath a canopy of silk, his armor polished and gleaming, his heart full of pride. "Let them eat their own," he said with a cruel smile, lifting his goblet high. "By the time we ride in, there will be no resistance, only bones." But even as he spoke, the wind shifted. Outside the camp, on a narrow, rocky path, 4 lepers limped toward the enemy stronghold. Their steps were slow, uncertain. They were too weak to run, too desperate to turn back. "If we die, we die," one of them whispered. But none of them did, because the moment they set foot on Aramean soil, the Lord unleashed his invisible army. It began with a sound, distant at first, a low hum, like a murmuring wind. Then louder, hoofbeats, metal clanging, the roar of chariots, the pounding of 1,000 feet. But there were no armies, no horses, no soldiers, only the divine illusion. Heaven itself had sent terror to fill the ears of the Arameans. From one end of the camp to the other, soldiers froze mid-laugh, goblets falling from trembling hands. They heard the unmistakable sound of war, an ambush, swift and deadly, descending upon them like a thunderstorm.
"The Israelites have hired the Egyptians,"
one cried. "No, the Hittites, they've brought chariots from the mountains." Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Ben-Hadad stood, wide-eyed as chaos erupted. His guards scattered, leaving him shouting orders no one heard. Within moments, tents were abandoned, horses left bridled, weapons dropped in the dirt. The Aramean army fled into the night, consumed by fear not of man, but of God. When the lepers reached the camp's edge, they stopped in disbelief. Silence. No guards, no scouts, no blades drawn against them. One by one they entered the tents. Food, wine, silver, gold, silk. They stood, dumbfounded. Then, laughter. Wild, uncontainable. They ate, they drank. They filled their hands with treasure and ran to bury it in the hills, certain the moment would vanish like a dream. But as the night wore on, their laughter faded. One of them stood and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "This isn't right," the others looked up. "What do you mean?" another asked. "We are not doing right," he said. "This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves." He turned toward the city walls glowing dimly in the distance. "If we wait until morning, punishment will find us. Let's go now. Let's tell the gatekeepers." And so the lepers returned, not as outcasts, but as heralds. They banged on the city gate. At first, no one believed them. Who would trust a leper? But the guards sent word to the palace. The king woke in the night to their report. Jehoram narrowed his eyes. "It's a trap," he whispered. "They've hidden in the fields, waiting for us to come out." But Elisha was summoned again. He stood in the same courtyard, calm and unshaken. "Send scouts," he said. "Let them go and see." And they did. By morning, the scouts returned with eyes wide, voices trembling. "The camp is empty," they cried. They left everything, food, gold, everything. The gates of Samaria opened at last, and the people poured out, not in fear but in joy, flour, barley, oil, bread. Tears streamed down the faces of children who had not smiled in weeks. Mothers held warm loaves like newborns. Fathers wept openly as pots once filled with boiling water now brimmed with stew and grain. The famine had ended. The siege was broken. God had spoken and made good on his word. But just beyond the city gate, in the midst of the crowd, someone else stood. The king's officer, the man who had doubted. As the mob surged forward, desperate for food, he was trampled beneath their feet. And so Elisha's final prophecy was fulfilled. You will see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. The sun rose over Samaria like a flame resurrected. Its light poured over the city walls, into the alleyways, across rooftops long soaked in shadow and silence. For the first time in weeks, no, in what felt like centuries, the city breathed. Not with gasps of sorrow, but with life. The streets that once echoed with hunger, and the soft sobs of mourning now pulsed with voices, joyful, grateful, disbelieving. Everywhere people gathered, cradling bundles of flour, laughing through tears, embracing one another like survivors of a storm that had almost claimed them all. In the open market, where stalls had once offered only dust and despair, merchants stood bewildered. Their hands shook as they weighed out barley, counted silver, and watched as bread disappeared faster than it could be stacked. Children ran through the square, chewing on fresh loaves, their faces smeared with honey and crumbs instead of dirt and tears. For many, it felt like a dream. For others, it felt like waking from a nightmare. And yet, amid the celebration, a quiet reverence lingered. Because the wounds were fresh, the scars still raw. The cost of survival lay heavy on every heart. Zimra walked slowly through the square, her feet light but her heart heavy. She held nothing in her hands, not barley, not flour, not even a piece of bread. The hunger in her belly had been replaced by a hollowness that food could never fill. She passed a stall where a young mother laughed while feeding her baby, a fat-cheeked child who squealed with delight at the taste of warm porridge. Zimra smiled faintly, then turned her eyes away. Her son would never laugh again. She sat near a well, watching the people. Some recognized her, most didn't. But a few paused, lowered their heads in guilt or sorrow or silent acknowledgement. She had been a symbol of their lowest moment, and now she remained a reminder of the price of despair. Tirzah appeared from the other side of the square, clutching a small bundle of food and holding Yael's hand tightly. The girl's face was fuller now, her lips pink with life. But her eyes carried the memory. They stopped before Zimra. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Tirzah knelt and placed the bundle at Zimra's feet. It was never fair, she whispered. But I never forgot. Zimra looked at the bundle, then at Yael. She reached out and gently brushed the girl's hair from her face. She has your strength, Zimra said softly. She has our shame, Tirzah replied. The silence between them was deep, but not angry anymore. It was mournful, honest, forgiving, even if not forgotten. As Tirzah stood to leave, Zimra called out gently, "Live better, for her." Tirzah nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Atop the palace wall, King Jehoram watched his city come alive. He wore no crown, no robe, only linen garments of mourning still, but his posture was different now, no longer bent under guilt, but lifted with humility. Elisha stood beside him. "The Lord has kept his word," Jehoram murmured. "Yes," the prophet replied. "But will you?" Jehoram nodded. "We will tear down every altar to false gods. We will teach our sons and daughters the truth. We will remember this, always." Elisha's eyes scanned the city. Let it not become another story of rescue forgotten. Let the mother's cries be a psalm of warning. Let the brokenness become wisdom. Below, bells rang from the temple. Priests called the people to worship, not with rituals of tradition, but with the gratitude of the rescued. Zimra stood as the sound echoed through the streets. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days she prayed, not for food, not for justice, not even for peace, just for strength, to live, to remember, to heal. and the dawn, at last, became day. In the end, the siege lifted, the food returned. But Samaria would never be the same, because some wounds do not vanish with bread and barley. Some memories, the boiling pot, the silence of a child, the cry of a betrayed mother, remain carved into the soul of a city. But so does the mercy, because even when humanity is at its worst, God is still God. He answers cries born from dust. He breaks sieges not with swords but with whispers. He gives hope through the most unlikely of hands, even those marked by leprosy or guilt. So remember this when the famine rages, when the world feels silent and your prayers return void, God is still near, waiting, watching, and preparing a miracle where no one dares to look. This was Samaria's story. But it could be any of ours. Because hunger comes in many forms, and deliverance is always closer than it seems.